Where's Abby?
Hi there, Presley here. The Last of Us Part 3 story and plot is officially complete. Even though the story outline is done, the game is still far from going into development. Let's look at where the series could go from The Last of Us Part 2. Just a disclaimer before we start, this video isn't intended to criticize or defend The Last of Us Part 2. I'm going to try and stay firmly on the fence. Having said that, as a neutral, let's take a look at some creative directions that the third installment could take. The Last of Us Part 2 might just be the most polarizing game of all time. Critics praised the game as a masterpiece, but fans were left disappointed to say the least. This leaves the creative team with a huge dilemma. Naughty Dog could either stick to their guns and double down and deliver more of what made The Last of Us Part 2 a critical success, or they could make a bold move and go for a huge change in direction to try and win over some fans. One of the most polarizing aspects of The Last of Us Part 2 were the themes that the game covered. The Last of Us Part 2's story was hugely focused in its themes. The next game in the series could continue to explore the same themes as The Last of Us Part 2. Alternatively, the next game could explore completely new themes. For example, revenge was a huge part of The Last of Us Part 2. The Last of Us Part 3's theme could be focused around redemption. This could be completely fitting and poetically symbolic. The lead characters, Ellie and Abby, both did awful things in the name of revenge in The Last of Us Part 2. The story could follow both characters' path to redemption in Part 3. After most fans turned their back on the series after The Last of Us Part 2, the series could do with redemption in The Last of Us Part 3. As mentioned before, if the series goes for a change in direction, a complete change of setting would be beneficial. This could mean a time jump. The Last of Us Part 1 and 2 were set in the mid-21st century. The Last of Us Part 3 could be set in the late 21st century. This way, Naughty Dog could explore what the world could look like many decades after the infection spread. Alternatively, if Naughty Dog were to stick with the same setting, there are still many characters and communities that could be expanded upon in The Last of Us Part 3. For example, Tommy or Dina could easily have their own stories. Alternatively, it would be interesting setting Part 3 in one of the enemy communities, such as the Seraphites or the Rattlers, as a huge theme in The Last of Us Part 2 was seeing the other side of the story. If that's too much of a stretch, any of the side characters in Jackson could also be developed if the game stuck with the same setting. If Naughty Dog do go down the route of a new setting, new characters would be inevitable. A new set of characters could be really refreshing for this series, as there will be no expectations from fans and therefore fans would be less likely to be disappointed. Having any of the old characters return might build up expectations from fans and again might lead to more disappointment, as with The Last of Us Part 2. Additionally, a lot of the characters' stories from The Last of Us Part 1 and Part 2 seem to have come to a natural end. It doesn't seem that there is much else left to tell from the lead characters Joel and Ellie. Adding to their story, whether it be through flashbacks or in the future, may just undermine what happened in the first and second games. On the other hand, if Naughty Dog were to stick with characters from the previous games, the two best choices would be Lev and Abby. The second half of The Last of Us Part 2 was entirely focused on Abby as a character. This could have been potentially setting her up for a lead role in future games. Likewise, Lev had a lot of screen time in The Last of Us Part 2. If The Last of Us Part 3 follows The Last of Us Part 2 and has two playable lead characters, this could be Abby and Lev. Another way Naughty Dog could refresh the series is by a drastic change of location. As mentioned before, if the developers decide to stick with the same characters and setting, there are plenty of existing locations that could be developed from The Last of Us Part 1 and Part 2. For example, there could be open world type exploration in friendly locations such as Jackson, or hostile locations such as Santa Barbara or Salt Lake City. Also, Part 3 could allow players to explore more of Boston, Ellie's hometown, or even Austin, Texas, Joel's hometown. An interesting change of location for The Last of Us Part 3 could be the East Coast of the United States. This could include cities like New York City and Washington, D.C. On the other hand, the West Coast could be just as interesting, with cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco. Southern parts of the USA could also make interesting locations, for example, Louisiana. However, what could be even more interesting for the series is if it was set in an entirely new country. Hong Kong, Japan, and anywhere in China would make an interesting location for a third game. It would be fascinating to see how other countries have coped with the infection. Before I move on to the next point, I would just like to say if you're enjoying this video, please leave a like and consider subscribing. Now, regardless of the setting, characters, and location, one thing that is a must for The Last of Us Part 3 is new gameplay elements. One criticism from fans was that The Last of Us Part 2 played almost exactly like The Last of Us Part 1 with very few additions. Even though the series is heavily story-based, it would be great to see additions to the gameplay in The Last of Us Part 3. For example, The Last of Us Part 3 could introduce new types of infected. This would be quite easy to fit into the story if the game was set at a later time period or in a different location. This would mean that the infection would have had time to develop, causing new mutations. These mutations would of course lead to new infected enemy types, which would be refreshing for the third part in the series. And there you have it, some creative directions that The Last of Us Part 3 could go. All that's left for me to say is take care, and I'll see you in the next video.